This is Duke University.
And it now would be my pleasure to invite two highly educated people who've shown their ability to put knowledge at the service of society on stage with me. The first grandfather of America and Duke University, President Jimmy Carter, grandparent of the class of '97, and his, I want to make sure to call you Senator. Is that I'm supposed to call you? Yes, okay. President Carter and Senator Carter, come and join me. Welcome to my office.
Thank you. Good talk. I enjoyed it very much.
It's a little bit like the Oval Office, don't you think?
You can see it. Well, a little fancier, more money floating around.
Nowadays there is. Let me introduce these people. They probably don't need to be introduced.
One of them.
President Jimmy Carter. I'm going to introduce Jimmy Carter at the Carter Center. Well, you have a biography that is almost mythological. Everyone knows you come from Plains, the man from Plains. Pretty many people remember that you went to college at the Naval Academy, and that then you actually were chosen to be one of the leaders in the first era of nuclear submarines and were trained in nuclear physics. And that sort of moment that's just so historical and so in such an advancement. Then you came back to your family home, which not every nuclear engineer did at that point, back to Plains and became the man from Plains again. And then you got bitten by the bug of public service. You became, I believe, a Georgia state senator. You believe, I know, the Georgia state governor, and a very famous one. You then were elected president of the United States in 1976. And let's just stop and remember, people sometimes speak as if our moment is a moment of unique difficulty and stress in American history. But this man became president at the time when faith in American institutions had reached its absolute low ebb in this country, when financial vicissitudes and economic challenges were probably as great as anything that has ever been seen, and when there was a divisiveness in this country. I vividly remember it. People speak as if this is a new phenomenon in our country, but actually it has a little bit of a history, and you were elected in that challenging time. In your presidency, we look back, I walk through these halls and I see the signing of the Camp David Accords. What an amazing accomplishment. You see the recognition of the State of Israel by Egypt. What an accomplishment. You were the president when the United States established diplomatic relations with the People's Republic of China. So you were president for a most historic time. But then you became something else, which is you became not only a great president, but the perhaps greatest ex-president in modern American history. Well, how many people in America were introduced to Habitat and the possibility of local civic volunteerism by you? Millions. How many people have read works by you? Millions upon millions. And then I think of the work that the Carter Center has been the focus of, work in not only in human rights, but in the broadest understanding of human rights, the understanding that health is the foundation of human rights, that freedom from violence is the foundation from human rights. And so your important work promoting free elections around the world, trying to defuse conflicts around the world, it has been an amazing career. And I just would like to express my personal gratitude to you for your ongoing work of that sort.
I mean,
and now
it's almost unfair.
And now,
I did go to Duke.
And now, for the absolute paragon, we turn to Senator Carter. Yes, indeed, you did go to Duke, and this is one of your claims to fame. You not only did that, you persuaded your grandfather to give the commencement address in Wallace Wade, which is, I may ask you a question or two about that whole business. Your grandfather said to you, "Don't worry, no one will remember anything I said 5 years from now." And you said to him, "That depends on what you say." Okay? After Jason Carter graduated, he went in the Peace Corps. You may remember that his famous great-grandmother had been in the Peace Corps. Everybody knew that. You served in South Africa, and when you came home, you wrote an extraordinarily interesting book called Power Lines about the experience of being in a rural setting in South Africa where power lines went overhead without dropping any electricity off in your local area. So the haves, just imagine that. You came home, you went to law school in this state, you are employed in a firm in this town, but then, I don't know what happened, then all of a sudden you ran for Senate. Right? Okay, we're not going to speculate about your future career. We're talking just about the present. But I must say, your university is very proud of you and looking at you, proud of the family culture of civic service that both of you embody. So maybe I'll start out this way, just with this question. When someone's had a long life, you typically take the end of it and you look backward as if, like all their life, they were heading toward that success. But of course, that's not the way it works, and it's certainly not the way education works. So there was a time when you, President Carter, were a student at Annapolis and then a nuclear engineer. You didn't, I mean, who knew what life awaited you then? I'm going to ask you both, but I'll ask you first. Tell us a little bit about the bend in your life, the life that led from education to public service, or to the discovery of the meaning of that for you.
Well, I was hoping you just continue to talk. I've really enjoyed what you had to say.
My dear Mr. President, with the slightest encouragement, I will do so.
Well, I had the best job in the Navy. I was in charge of building the second atomic submarine, the Seawolf, and I was working for Admiral Rickover, one of the great leaders of our time, the best engineer perhaps who's ever lived. And I was studying nuclear physics at Union College in Schenectady in New York. And I had a good career ahead of me. But I went home at the time of my father's death, and I sat by his bedside for 2 weeks. He had pancreatic cancer. We knew he was going to die. And I saw the people coming in streams to the back door, some of them, and to the front door, the others, just to tell me privately, since my father wasn't able to talk, what his life had meant to them. And I'll make a long story short. At the end of that visit, to the consternation of my wife, I decided to resign from the Navy. And Senator Richard Russell was my senator, and he was able to comply with my desire. And so I went back home with the intention of staying there, trying to walk in my father's footsteps, serve other people in the community, both African American and white, and make a name for myself there. And I became a Sunday school teacher. I was leader of the Boy Scouts. I was the chairman of the local school board. I was on the hospital authority, and so forth. And so I immersed myself in community affairs. And later, when I was the chairman of the school board, there was a threat to the public school system. I was 38 years old, and I decided that I would try to save the public school system under threat from segregationists who would close it down if African Americans went into the classroom. So that's why I ran for the state senate, just to save the public school system. And I used my limited influence to get on the education committee. Not a lot of people were fighting to get on it. And I was able to become chairman of the university committee, and then I served a couple of terms and decided to run for governor.
If I could,
Is that what you wanted?
If I could summarize,
all right.
One thing led to another.
Yeah, I didn't.
But not because you saw the end of the others.
No, I didn't at all.
Okay, so you could say a good way to begin the path to become president of the United States is to be a Sunday school teacher and a Boy Scout leader. Well, I mean, it's caring about more than your own success. I mean, that's really what you've described. So how about you? The funny thing about Jason is, or Senator Carter, is one of the Duke people I've known longest was your roommate in college. I knew him before I knew you. You went to college. You were a college guy, and then you went into the Peace Corps, and now you're in public service. So tell me a little bit about how that opened up for you.
Well, I first of all, my roommate Thomas called me and mentioned that you had sent an email to him.
I did.
Not recognizing we were going to be here, and he said he's just the nicest guy. I mean, he's nice enough that he would send me an email. So congratulations. I mean, that's a brilliant political move from an amateur politician.
I'm not running for office because I'm already president.
Well, I think you mentioned my great grandmother.
I did.
And she turned 70 in the Peace Corps. And I think that that experience in the 1960s, before Papa was governor, or very informal. I call him Papa. You can definitely call me Jason. Too. But before Papa was...
I don't call him that.
I think that her experience in the Peace Corps really infected our whole family with, and some of it obviously predated that. I mean, the ethos that led her to the Peace Corps had always been there. But that experience, I think, of going all the way across the world for, essentially a little old lady from Plains, Georgia, was one that I think really, I know that when Papa was done being president, he was still a young person, and she was there knowing that she had turned 70 in the Peace Corps and asking him what he was going to do. And so that, I think, charges some of what led to that. But for me, I wanted to do that. I was interested in international development, and everyone I talked to in that field had been in the Peace Corps. And so I decided to do that. And I think that I had a similar experience to the one that he had, because I rented a room from a woman there who, in South Africa, her name was, we called her Gogo, which is the Zulu word for grandmother. And she had lived her life, constrained by apartheid. And it told her where she could go to school, what jobs were reserved for her, where she could live, etc. And in 1975, they forcibly removed her from her home and dropped her off in essentially the middle of nowhere. Mm-hmm. And I got there 23 years later, and she was the postmaster, the chair of the school governing body, the
Jimmy Carter.
Exactly, of this small town. I mean, and she did everything. The dressmaker, she was a successful business person. And all I think about today, and I always think about is, what would she have done if she was Jimmy Carter's grandson?
So it's partly a family culture explanation?
I think so.
Forces of example inside the family? Okay, one of the things I love about what you say is your education didn't end when you graduated from Duke, because you also learned in the Peace Corps from the example of people who were there.
He learned also at the Carter Center as an intern.
True. That is true.
Let me ask you, Jason. So you live at Duke. Mm-hmm. That was great. And then you go to sleep and you wake up, and now you're living in rural South Africa. What were one or two of the most, you had to open your mind. It's like when I talk about Duke Engage, is the first lesson is that people discover that the world of human life is actually very different from the world seen in universities. And this is an experience, obviously, you had.
And I think, South Africa is an interesting place for a host of reasons. And when I was there, Mandela was still the president. Right. I mean, this was sort of the post-apartheid almost euphoria, but the beginning of the post-apartheid struggle. There was so much residue of apartheid that was there. But I guess the first thing, it's a very different place. I mean, and one of the things that I did there is I learned to speak Zulu, and it's my great party trick that, if you'll allow me, we would say to the group, I guess, Ekaleni ifuna kubonga lithuba lokuxoxa nani. And so you don't know what I said, which is good. But
the clicks were good.
It is a cultural shock on some level. Sure. That's what I expected. What I didn't expect was that you have a lot of, in South Africa, it was cold, and there were a lot of rich white people. And when I went to Africa, that wasn't what I expected. Right. And that moving back and forth between those two South Africas, of being able to go to Pretoria to a Starbucks and to come back to where I lived, where people, as you said, carried their water from the river and built their houses out of sticks and mud. There's a lot of dissonance that occurs there. And people would come up to me, and little kids at the preschool would come up to me and touch my arm because they'd never touched a white person's arm before. And there was all sorts of things that went along with that process. And as you mentioned, there's this book that's still for sale about my experiences. It's called Power Lines.
Power Lines.
But that's it. I mean, it's trying to live in two places at the same time, and to try to come to terms with the fact that, when I came back from the Peace Corps after living with this community, my wife and I decided to get married, or she agreed after much cajoling for me. She also went to Duke, and we went to Crate and Barrel and registered for our wedding. And you take this gun and you zap all the little things that you need, like 8 highball glasses. And we got done, and I'd been back from the Peace Corps for about 4 months, and I stood on the street outside Crate and Barrel and just cried, because I didn't really need 8 highball glasses, and I knew it. And it was that idea of being in a different place, trying to live in multiple places at the same time and knowing what we have here that we take for granted every day, I think was the most eye-opening thing for me.
President Carter, when you spoke at the Duke graduation, I've been told a story, and I don't know if it's apocryphal, that you had to throw out your speech and improvise one because your grandson was so critical. Whether that's true or not, I've actually read the speech, and your speech makes an amazing point. You make the point that people in this country are rich, and you don't mean that everyone is equally rich. You mean that in this country there is the normal experience of having things and having access to things and the expectation of things. I'm just interested in sort of throwing that to you as to sort of how that, well, of course, your family has been both rich and not so rich in the course of your own life.
Well, when I was president, I learned a lot about third world,
yes.
But that was about it. I knew the third world, I knew where they were, and I would try every year to get foreign aid at a very high level, and the Congress would always cut it down. And so it was only after I left the White House that I got to be immersed in 70 countries around the world, the poorest ones on earth, that I really began to learn about these people as human beings. I had been raised in a segregated area. Right. I was on a farm west of Plains. All my neighbors were black people, and I was raised in a black culture. But even they, had plenty to eat, and they had nice, fairly good homes in which to live. They had a school to which to attend, and they had fairly good medical care. But when I got to learning about people in Africa, I saw that they were completely different level of human life. They didn't have anything of which they could be proud. They perhaps would go through their entire life without never knowing of a single success coming to them. They had very little reason for self-respect or hope for the future. And then Rosa and I began to build habitat homes. For 28 years now, we've gone for 1 week on somewhere and built habitat homes. And those people had never had a decent home, have built homes side by side with us, and they will own the home and pay for it eventually over a long period of time. But I began to see that the people to which we delivered medicines in Africa and the people for whom we built habitat homes, as I got to know them, it was kind of dawned on me that they were just as intelligent, just as hardworking, just as ambitious, and their family values were just as good as mine. And there's a genuine sense now in my life of equality between me and them in the eyes of God. And that has come to me after I left the White House and after I left the culture in which I was raised. So I think that's the main thing that's come to me. It's not a matter of superiority or generosity or handing out gifts to others who are less than you. They just haven't had a chance in life. And that's what the Carter Center does. And that's what I've done for the last 30 years with my wife.
Well, I'm going to stop and take that one in for a minute because, of course, we know so much that the culture of help and aid is based on the idea that we understand these things and you don't. We come with these benefits and you lack them, which, of course, in a sense is true. But then there's another sense in which what you're saying is after you were president, you got a sense of the humanity of humans yet more powerful than you had had before.
Certainly.
Let me ask you a question about, you've been a great proponent of democracy around the world. Yes. And I'm going to ask you a bunch of questions about this, and you can also chime in at any point. Let me go back. What I said before, I've been thinking for the last several days about introducing you, and I've been reflecting, our culture, as you know, is very present-oriented, and so people don't really stop and remember that much what it was like in America in the middle 70s. And when I talk about the crisis of faith in American institutions, what an extraordinary experience that was at that time, and the economic shocks that came to this country one after another through the 70s, which were really mostly a recessionary period. And if you think of the cultural clashes and generational clashes there were in that really almost every family and every community lived at this time. I'm just wondering if you would offer your thoughts about the present situation and that one there, and how different you find them, how similar, how...
Well, we had been through a series of embarrassments in our country with the Watergate scandal and the president having to resign in disgrace, with the failed Vietnam War that really had no reason for us to become involved in it, in which to begin, with the Frank Church exploration of facts that showed that our CIA, with the approval of the president, was committing murder in other countries to get rid of leaders with whom we didn't agree. Those kind of things had oppressed the American people. In addition to that, there was the assassination of John Kennedy and Robert Kennedy and Martin Luther King Jr. All of this came along just before I came in office. But I would say that the most overriding concern that I had was that it was in the midst of the Cold War. And I never left for a moment in my mind the fact that in 26 minutes after the Soviets launched any kind of missile, they would reach Washington and New York. And I had to decide how to respond during that 26 minutes with an arsenal of nuclear weapons that could destroy the entire Soviet Union. So I was primarily concerned during my administration of maintaining peace. And I had a lot of challenges, which I need not list, but I was able during that time, with prayer and with careful diplomacy, to avoid war. We never dropped a bomb, we never launched a missile, we never fired a bullet while I was in office. But we maintained peace for ourselves, we brought peace to others, like Egypt and Israel and with China and with Panama and so forth, which you've already mentioned. So those were the circumstances under which I served. And we had very high unemployment rate when I got into office. We had a threat of Arab boycott against sending us fuel.
I remember.
Those kinds of things. So you remember those well. So it was a challenging time, but we were very successful in going through the 4 years with relative impunity and did some good things.
Well, you mentioned the word peace.
Yes.
And of course, a lot of as you talk about the fact that in your career, your sense of humanity broadened after your time in office instead of shrinking. And I'm sure that your sense of the importance of peace also. I said before, as part of my understanding of you, is that you are a great advocate of human rights, but you understand that not only as the right to vote or technical rights of things of that sort, but the freedom from violence, the freedom from civil strife, things of that sort. And you know, you've gone every hard place in the course of your life, right?
Pretty much.
You have.
I don't think I've overlooked many.
I don't think you've overlooked many, and I don't think anyone would say you've shied away from many. Well, okay, but now you've learned the lesson as well as anyone, which is there's some, humankind has its glories, but it seems to produce violence and strife right along with the rest. Yeah. What would be your sense of the lesson of your life about the possibilities of bringing peace or avoiding conflict?
Well, another thing that I've learned since I left the White House has been the definition of human rights. If you ask anybody in this audience to name the human rights that are important, they would list the freedom of assembly, freedom of speech, freedom of religion, trial by jury, and so forth. But if you go to the average country in Africa and ask the poor people there, what are your basic rights, they would say the right to have a home in which to live, the right to have food to eat, the right to have health care, the right to have some degree of education, the right to have self-respect, the right to have hope that the future will be better. Those are the kind of rights that are extra important for them, which we sometimes ignore. And our country is one of the most stingy on earth as far as sharing our great wealth with other people in Africa and places that are poverty-stricken. When I go, which I do often to raise money, to Norway and Sweden and Denmark and the Netherlands and so forth, when any of their people run for Congress or the Parliament, one of their primary campaign promises is, if I'm elected, I'm going to increase foreign aid. I'm going to enhance the...
I can't remember the last time I heard that in this
country.
Well,
if you heard it in this country, it would be suicidal. Mm-hmm. But there's a difference in attitude among many people, particularly in Europe, former colonial powers, in trying to enhance democracy and freedom and the alleviation of suffering and the enhancement of the environment. Mm-hmm. We don't have those feelings in our country, and it's something that I think we will have in the future as we get more immersed in the globalization and a sense of equality with other nations, like I have just described with my sense of equality with other people. We're going to see in the future China and India and maybe Brazil and some others that I need not name come up equal to us almost in American, in world governance and world influence.
And I think that what I see that's reflected in what he just mentioned, what I see every day is that the biggest sort of difference, the biggest division in our politics, in Georgia, I think, in our country right now, is you have a group sort of broadly defined of people who believe that we're all in it together. and that freedom for person A is just as valuable as freedom for person B, and no matter where they live or what they look like or who they are. And then you have another group of people who really don't have that belief, who don't fundamentally believe that as a first and foremost principle, we're all in it together. They believe that we feel like our community needs to get what it needs first, and then deal with other things. And I'm not, I tend to be in that first group of that I described, as you may expect from my genetic defects that I have. But that division is really important, and I think it underlies so much stuff. We talk about freedom in the Georgia legislature as a 0.5 point on your income tax. You know what I mean? We do. That's what people say about freedom. You go down there and you pound the table about being free because we're going to cut income tax by 0.5 point.
Well, okay, I've asked your grandfather a harder question or two, and I'm going to ask you one now. What do you see as the prospects for broadening the community of people who believe we're all in it together, as opposed to the community? You know that economic hard times always throw people back on narrow self-interest. It was certainly true in the Depression. It was true in the 1890s. It was true in other times. What's your prognosis for that?
Well, I think that, on some level you have to meet people where they are.
Yes.
It is important to recognize how valuable and important it is for people to have what they need and to have what they think they need. But I believe, as he mentioned, that we are, in fact, all in it together in a way that is different from before. You cannot have the city of Atlanta without a global economy. It touches Plains, Georgia. It touches where I live in Atlanta. Those issues, the pocketbook issues that maybe somebody has, you have a gated community. You can put the gate up, but it doesn't prevent the world from piling in and from impacting your life. And so that interdependence is just fact. And as that becomes clearer, and as people become more comfortable with that global economy and those erosion of those walls between different kinds of people, I think that we'll merge together. You'll still have those same divisions of people, and you just have to press on.
Okay. So President Carter, when you became president, I bet you had no idea how much of your time would be spent on issues of the Middle East. Later, the world has become much broader for you than the Middle East. But I'm interested in asking you, you're a person who actually saw an autocratic government overthrown by a popular uprising, which led to the succession of regimes in Iran that we know now. So you well know that popular uprisings don't automatically guarantee the increase of democracy or human rights in the world. What's your take on what's going on now? Now, last spring we were thrilled as we watched the spark pass from country to country, but none of us really know what the outcome of that the developments in that part of the world will be. What's your hunch?
Well, I guess my prediction is that 2011 is going to go down in world history as a turning point in the Middle East, in the so-called Arab Spring and its consequences in Libya and in Tunisia and in Egypt already, and maybe impending in Syria. Sometimes with violence, sometimes with suffering, but the people are fighting, as Americans did 200 and something years ago, for our own liberty and freedom. And the Carter Center is deeply involved in those countries. One of our major tasks now is to monitor the election in Egypt, which started in November and will end in June. For the parliament and then for president and the new constitution. We've already finished the election in Tunisia. And so I think that this is a matter that has potential tremendous benefit for the people as they find freedom and democracy for the first time. But we have to remember it's going to take a long time to do it. We can't expect it to be done in 1 year or 2 years or 3 years. There's going to be some growing pains and some setbacks and some difficulties, starts and stops. As far as a key issue in the Middle East that affects every life in Syria, every life in Jordan, every life in Lebanon and Egypt and so forth, it's the Palestinian issue. And if I've had one constant prayer for the last 30 years, including before I went into the White House, is to bring peace to Israel. And that means peace between Israel and Israel's neighbors. And so that's a kind of a cancer that is growing there that I'm afraid will be continuing in its detrimental effect on the other countries around it. When I was in Egypt just a few days ago monitoring the election, I met with the Arab Brotherhood leaders, both their political leaders who were running the campaign very effectively, and also their religious leaders. And the main reason I wanted to go was to make sure they promised me personally that they would not disrupt the application of the peace treaty that we negotiated between Begin and Sadat. So I think peace between Egypt and Israel and in the future will be a key factor that might bring about a halcyon prospect for the entire Arab Spring.
Yeah. You talk about monitoring elections, and I know I should let somebody else ask a question, but I'm going to ask about two more. I've never monitored an election. You've monitored. How many elections have you monitored? How many elections has the Carter Center participated in?
87th.
You're 87th. I learned about it once upon a time, actually this January.
By the way, we would be glad to have you go with us on one of our elections in the future. If you could break away for a few days.
I would be happy to volunteer, and I'm sure the campaigning for Duke's student body president will soon be taking place, and you would be very welcome to come back. I'll just tell you something, which is I mentioned before that Duke has entered into a partnership with a city next to Shanghai, that it is the city with the highest per capita income and sort of technical development in China, but they know they don't have the education to support these developments. So it's a very interesting analysis they've undertaken. When I was there last, I learned that one of the villages in this city had an election, and that President Carter had come to monitor this election.
Yeah.
In the city of Kunshan, there is a little place called Zhouzhuang, if I remember right, which is like Venice. It's like a water town with canals and marble bridges and stuff like that. And that's the village that had the election, and you monitored their election in the year 2001.
Yes, I did.
Do you remember it?
Of course I do. As a matter of fact, China has 650,000 small villages. And the Carter Center has a contract with the government of China for the last more than 12 years to monitor the application of the existing laws to those little villages so they can have completely honest, democratic ballots with secret voting and so forth.
Who knew?
Can I ask a question?
Yeah.
Where do you see that? I know we had this conversation the other day, but where do you see, do you think that is the seed from which the rest of the democracy in China becomes inevitable?
Inevitable is a strong word. I'll just talk about the prospect very quickly.
All right.
Okay.
When we announced normalization plans with Deng Xiaoping on the 15th of December, 1978, 3 days later, he announced openness and reform in China.
That's right.
And until then, there was no democracy, there was no freedom, there was no free enterprise in China. And now it's been completely transformed in economic freedom, as you know. Well, in 1982, at the first meeting of our National People's Congress, they passed a law authorizing little villages to have honest elections. They're not part of the Communist Party system. They're below the Communist Party system. And in 1987, 5 years later, they mandated it. And then they called on the Carter Center to enforce the law because they knew that we monitored elections. And so we hoped at that time, under Deng Xiaoping, that there would be a continuation and reform of political democracy.
Right.
And it was making pretty good progress under Jiang Zemin, his successor. Hu Jintao, the present president, I think has been adversely affected by the Arab Spring and other uprisings to clamp down on the political democratization process. So right now there's a kind of a hiatus in China about no further move toward democratic freedom. But I've met already with Xi Jinping, who was over here this week, 3 times. When I go to China, they want me to meet with the president and future leaders.
Sure.
And I think Xi Jinping has within him the inclination, at least, to go toward more political democracy. If I said that in China, it would be detrimental to him.
I understand.
But
and I hope no one is recording anything you say.
But I think that's true, and I believe that the Chinese people, the students and others with unlimited access to the outside world through the internet and so forth, will continue to insist on a moderate amount of democracy. It may be a step-by-step process, but I believe that inevitably China is going to have a similar democracy in politics to what they have now in economics. Maybe not patterned after American democracy, which they don't trust. They see the handicaps we have here. But I think they'll have their own form of democracy. Well, I had a little research done in which I learned that the per capita income in China in the year you just mentioned, 1978, was $182, and last year between $5,000 and $6,000. So this is one of the most extraordinary and unforeseen developments that's taken place in the world of your adult life.
right? And I'll tell you a story, which is I went to a high school in Nanjing once. It was just at the time that Google had announced it was going to pull out of China. So there was all this to do about free exchange. And so I was going to go do a Q&A session with high school students. And I thought, well, this will give me a little of an idea what a repressive society is really like. So I went in. The first question was, what do you think about the Google decision? They knew everything about it. They knew every possible point of view about it. I mean, so, it's a little hard to, that's itself a new fact.
Well,
Jason?
the Chinese students are really remarkable. I made a speech at Hunan University not too long ago where Claire Chennault was during the Second World War. And I spoke to 6,000 Chinese students, and then they asked me questions from the audience, all in English.
Of course.
There were no translators.
Their English was better than your Mandarin.
Well, their English was a lot better than some American students' English, but I could understand them.
Not Duke students.
Not Duke students. Yeah. But I learned today that of the entering students at Emory, 10% of the total entering students requested Mandarin Chinese as a language. But Emory is not yet prepared to honor that great demand for Chinese.
One more good reason to go to Duke.
Duke has 10% Chinese?
I'm going to ask.
Be careful now. I've been a professor at Emory for 30 years. So,
Oh, and I forgot to thank you. Our new Dean of Arts and Sciences came to us from Emory last year, where she was the chair of the religion department.
And I'm sure well trained.
Perfect. Completely wonderful. Let me ask a final question. I began by asking the two of you how your lives, you went from your youth through college, and then you thought you knew what you were going to do next, but you didn't really foresee the blossoming of the public dimension of your careers. It's true of both of you. I'm interested in just sort of how you would gauge the health of civic culture in America at this time, and especially on the young end. You hear so many things. People, offer gross generalizations about youth nowadays. And so in 2008, you were assured every American child wants to save the world. Then 2 years later, no one is willing to cross the street to take any trouble for anyone else. I'd actually be interested to hear your take on this.
I think that young people sometimes get a bad name. And in fact, you have a lot more active and engaged of it. I think this generation, not my generation, but the one that's behind me, is a lot more active and engaged than I was, certainly, and than I think my generation was in general. And I think because there's a lot more, frankly, civic engagement and community service work and a lot more interest, as you said, 400 and however many students are going to be a part of the Engage program. And I see that in high schools and everywhere else. Kate teaches at Grady High School, and the students that she teaches are out in their community, period, all the time. Right. And I think that the corollary there, though, is they don't get as involved in the political decision-making process and in the voting process as maybe we would all want. Because they are engaged and they do things in their community, but they want to do it with their hands that they can see and feel. And I think that one of the most difficult things, even for my generation, is figuring out what success looks like. Okay. I mean, for your generation, there were moments to celebrate. I mean, the Voting Rights Act. As I said, I was in South Africa when Mandela was elected. That's right. Well, the second black president of South Africa has a very different task. A very different task. There's no celebratory end to the post-apartheid struggle. It's just, do the technicians that we have from public policy schools and other places push the ball forward a little more every generation? And I just don't think that young people now have that ultimate goal that they're shooting for, or that celebration moment that they can fight for. But they do more of that every day. We're going to move the ball in our community and do AmeriCorps, the Peace Corps.
I remember seeing a person interviewed by Judy Woodruff, Duke alum, in 2010, a person of the age of about 23 who said, "I'm not going to vote in this election because I voted last time and I was disappointed in the results." Okay? You go around and you monitor elections, but we know that all the good things in the world aren't accomplished by elections and voting alone. They're accomplished by the kind of daily life you talked about and that you talked about everywhere you are. And if you ever have a glorious moment of success, that's a lucky thing. Right. But you can't, if you're only motivated by that, a lot of good things aren't going to be done.
Thank you. Good questions.
I've been disappointed by the outcome of many elections. I still vote, but
you still run.
Right, that's right. I haven't been disappointed by the outcome of the ones I was in yet.
This is great. my thanks to these fantastic partners.
Thanks.
So, can we? Will you stick around? Will you stick around for a question or two? I got to have the fun of asking all the questions, but we could take 2 or 3 questions from the floor. None of us can see you, so please. Oh, where? Oh, there you are. Hello.
I'd like to ask, you mentioned that maybe the overarching concern of your presidency was within the context of the Cold War. So you're an old President Carter, an old Cold Warrior, as it were. So I wonder, it's hard to believe it's been more than 20 years.
It's incredible.
The Soviet Union ceased to be. And I was wondering if you'd comment on the current political climate there, what's happening, and how Putin's fortunes are seemingly turned, as it were, that people are becoming more bold, as it were, standing up to him and his sluggishness.
Well, it was a good while after I left the White House that the Soviet Union disintegrated into Russia and 11 other entities. And of course, Putin has come along as a strong man, and at a time when I think the Soviet people, the Russian people rather, were looking for some cohesion in their government, and after the dissolution of what they had always known. And then he served as president, as you know, then 4 years maybe 5 years as prime minister, now he's running for president again, and I think he'll be reelected. But I think this is the first indication of openly demanding basic rights of free speech and demanding that there be a change in government policy. And I think it's too early for me. I'm not an expert on the Soviet Union, Russia, as you can tell, but I think it's too early to say how much this public demonstration of disapprobation will affect Putin's policies if and when he is elected president again. Russia has enormous wealth, as you know, perhaps more oil and gas wealth than any other country, even including perhaps Saudi Arabia. And so I think they have a pretty assured future, economically, at least for the foreseeable future. Politically, though, they have a long way to go, but this may be the turning point, as you indicated in your question, toward more democracy in Russia to come. I think Russia is one of those countries, too, that might very well evolve, if it does democratize, into a leading power on earth. One of the major good books that I've read lately is by Dr. Brzezinski, who said that eventually the West, that is Europe and the United States and so forth, should reach out to Russia and to Turkey, those two particular, to incorporate them into the Western culture, looking at things over a 5 or 10 year period in the future. I think that's a very good move for us to try to strengthen our ties with Russia, depending on the opportunities we have, and bring them in to the rest of Europe and the United States and Canada and so forth as part of the Western culture.
Here's one over here.
Sure, Mike Vincent. Hi, Jason. My question is this. I mean, you guys are in different times, obviously, when you're serving in political office, but the political process in this country seems to be somewhat broken. It's at least damaged at this point. We're not getting anything accomplished. Can you talk, Jason, from your perspective in the state Senate and then from a national perspective, President Carter, about the political process then versus now and what can be done to try to get people to compromise instead of just trying to knock down their opponents?
I'll say this about the state Senate at a minimum, and I don't, I'd be interested to hear your view on what the state Senate was like when you were there, but it is a lot less partisan than I thought it was going to be. And I had very low expectations, but I mean, it has exceeded them pretty remarkably. And I think probably 95% of the time, the folks that are down there in your state Senate are just trying to get to the right answer. And that 5% of the time are the hyper-partisan issues that we spend all of our time and energy on, and that you hear about and that get reported in the media. But I have been surprised at how collegial and sort of well-meaning the folks down there were. And again, I had low expectations in that regard. And I think that the fact that there's not much attention paid helps.
Let me just butt in and ask you,
yeah.
Do you contrast this with the scene in Washington? I must say, I know people in the House of Representatives
yes.
who do not report that.
I think so. I mean, I have no interest at all in ever going to Washington. It does. I mean, I don't think the folks that I know had a very good time.
That's what you used to say.
Yeah, but it is I do think it's different, and I think it's different because there's so much less money involved. There's still too much money involved in the state legislature here. I mean, I raised $300,000 run for the state senate, and it is too much, but that all gets amplified at the national level, and I think that the amplification of the attention that gets paid, the money that flows in, all makes for worse government and a much less pleasant time, it certainly seems to me.
Well, talking about the Senate, when I was there, we had a very wonderful Senate. We had 53 Democrats and 3 Republicans.
Yeah, that's right. That does sound nice. That does sound nice.
And it was a fairly contentious body. I mean, we had a lot of debates. But I think the national scene now has deteriorated dramatically since I was involved in running for president twice. The country is polarized. Money has infused the political situation far beyond what anybody ever dreamed, particularly with the stupid decision that the Supreme Court made 2 years ago. And we've seen that where the campaigns for the Republican nomination are dominated by money and by negative advertising. And as a matter of fact, most of that money that flows in is used for destroying your opponent's reputation and character. And American people say, we don't like that, but it works still. Right. It works. And so this polarization that generates in a congressional race or Senate race or presidential race carries over to Washington. So now there's a tremendous amount of absolute polarization with practically zero cooperation between the Republicans and Democrats in Washington. In fact, they don't even eat together anymore in the Senate dining hall, I understand. And this was quite different from when I ran. When I ran against Gerald Ford, who was a wonderful incumbent president, he and I referred to each other as my distinguished opponent. And when I ran against then-Governor Ronald Reagan, we were my distinguished opponent. You know how much money we raised from lobbyists and other people? Nobody, none, zero. We financed our entire campaigns in both elections just on the $2 per person checkoff that the average taxpayer indicates. So the money was practically non-existent then in presidential races. So it's completely different now. I think the only way we're going to overcome this blight, as I would call it, on the political scene in America is for the Supreme Court ruling basically to get reversed. We monitor all these elections around the world. We wouldn't monitor an election unless they had 2 things. One was a central election commission, which we don't have. We have a separate election commission in every county in America, more than 4,000 of them. And also, we require that every candidate who qualifies to run for office has to have equal access to the television and radio in that community. So money doesn't buy domination. Now, of course, to hope to get the nomination for a Democrat or a president in our country, Republican, would take a minimum of $300 or $400 million, perhaps more. So I'm really discouraged about what the early prospect will be in America, but I know that resilience is one of the characteristics of American people. We've always been able to overcome difficulties in the past, and I feel sure that in the long term, we'll overcome this one as well.
I hope so. It's further than pleasant.
So, ma'am, and let's take these 2.
I am curious about the voter impressions of the Occupy movement.
Well, I think the Occupy movement has been relatively successful, even acknowledging the fact that there's no leadership, there's no coherence, there's no single list of issues that they want to achieve. But I think it's I think it has brought about a realization that our country is suffering from horrendous polarization and a separation that's very dramatic in tangible terms between the richest people in America and the poorest people. And the chasm is getting greater by leaps and bounds. I think that issue was basically ignored by the Congress and by the news media a year ago or so. I think that's one thing that the Occupy movement has achieved, is putting that back on the agenda. And I believe that's going to be a major issue in the 2012 presidential election, is this difference between the two, not trying to create polarization or differences or class warfare, but just pointing out injustice in the tax system that exists now, primarily oriented for the oil companies and others with special benefits.
And I would just say that the impact that it has had on our public discourse is undeniably good. And I have just because you've opened up so many different discussions, and tactics aside, I think that's true. I have, politicians these days are all trying to figure out how to use social media to do different things. And I have a bunch of Facebook friends, and a huge number of them posted something the other day that said that was put out originally by an Occupy group that said, why is it easier to believe that 150 million Americans are lazy rather than 400 being greedy? And I thought, that's a pretty interesting question. But that's the kind of discourse that we didn't have, as he said, a year ago. So,
I occasionally run into Duke alums who say, I haven't been in the president's office since I occupied it. I saw you, sir, and we'll make this the last.
I'm interested in your view about the escalation between Israel and Iran, what it means to the world economy and what it means to us here.
Good. Well, I think it's one of the major issues that is going to affect our country and Israel, obviously, in the near future. I don't think any American politician, the Republicans running for a nomination or President Obama, can ignore the threat of Iranian nuclear capability, that is, having nuclear weapons. And I think we should do whatever we can to stop it. I would be strongly against any peremptory military operation started by Israel or the United States now. I think we ought to exhaust thoroughly any other means by which we can induce Iran to forego their move toward nuclear weapons. Another thing that I believe is that Iran has not yet made a decision about what to do. I'm just guessing about this. But the leaders of Iran, who are deeply religious people, whether you agree with them or not, have sworn before God that this is contrary to their basic religious faith to develop nuclear weapons. And they're not going to do it. And, of course, Ahmadinejad says we're not going to do it as well. I don't know if they're telling the truth or not. But I think that what concerns me about the present threats are that if I was in Iran and I was trying to decide should I develop nuclear weapons or not, and every day Israel and the United States is threatening to attack me, that would be one of the things that would induce me to develop a nuclear weapon. So I think we ought to stop the threats of attacking Iran until we completely exhaust every opportunity to resolve the issue peacefully. And I think the political constraints, the economic constraints on Iran are having a very major factor on Iran's decision. Ahmadinejad yesterday called for the resumption of his 6 power talks. And I read an article in The Economist magazine this morning where India is now very seriously concerned about whether to please America in not buying any Iranian oil or cut off our long-time supply of Iranian oil, which is now down to about 10% for India. So it's a major issue, and I think that the best result is that Iran not have nuclear weapons and that we induce that consequence by peaceful means.
And I would just say that listening to that, and present company excluded, including me, we are all glad that the Georgia Senate does not get involved in Middle East politics.
There we go.
And I'm glad I don't have to make the decisions anymore.
Our questions could go on all night, and the one thing you're sure is, if the questions went on all night, the intelligent answers would come back all night, too. It has just been such a pleasure and such an honor to be on stage with the two of you. Jason, I greet you. Ralph Waldo Emerson said to the poet Walt Whitman, I greet you at the beginning of a great career. We are proud to have you as an alum, and as the first grandfather of Duke University, President Carter, you've been a fantastic guest. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much. Very good. You're a good moderator.
Produced by Duke University. Online at duke.edu.